The folder landed on the table in front of me before I even sat down. $10 million. I did not need to open it to know the number, because Victor Kane said it out loud, in a voice so calm it felt like a threat wrapped in silk. Sign it, Claire. Walk away with more money than your bakery will make in 20 lifetimes. I looked at the folder, then at him, then at the four men standing near the door like statues carved out of bad intentions. The private room at the back of the Hollow Street Club smelled like cigars and expensive perfume, and every person in it was watching me the way people watch a car crash they cannot look away from. No, I said. The word came out steadier than I expected. My hands were shaking under the table, but my voice held. Victor tilted his head, the way a man does when he hears something for the first time in years, something he does not know how to file away. No, he repeated, testing the shape of it. People do not say no to me, Claire. Then I suppose I am the first. A short laugh came from one of the men by the door, quickly swallowed when Victor's eyes moved toward him. The room went quiet again, that thick kind of quiet that presses on your ears. I want to explain how I got here, sitting across from a man whose name made grown business owners change their prices, their locations, sometimes their whole lives. But there was no time for that explanation, not with him watching me the way he was, like he was solving a puzzle that refused to behave. 6 months ago, I opened a small bakery on Vine Street. I called it Bennett's, after my father, Henry Bennett, who taught me how to fold dough before he taught me how to ride a bicycle. The shop was nothing fancy, a counter, 8 tables, a window that let in the morning sun in a way that made the whole street smell like cinnamon and butter by 7 in the morning. It became popular faster than I expected. Lines out the door on weekends. A feature in a local food blog, a modest write-up in the city paper calling it the best-kept secret on Vine Street, which meant it stopped being a secret within a week. I did not know, back then, that Vine Street sat 2 blocks from a building Victor Kane owned. I did not know that the block was part of something larger, something with roots that went deeper than rent and property lines. I only knew that one Tuesday morning, a man in a gray suit walked in, ordered a coffee he did not drink, and asked to speak to the owner. That man was Nathan Ford, and he worked for Victor. He was polite in the way people are polite, right before they ask you to give up something important. Mr. Kane would like to buy your building, Nathan said, sliding a card across the counter, and the shop, and the recipes, if you're willing to discuss terms. I told him the shop was not for sale. He smiled like I had made a joke, thanked me for the coffee I never charged him for, and left. That should have been the end of it. It was not. Over the following weeks, small things started happening. A supplier I had used for 2 years suddenly could not fill my order. A city inspector showed up twice in 1 month, for reasons that felt invented. My landlord, a kind older woman named Grace Whitmore who had never once been late returning my calls, stopped answering for 3 days straight. When she finally called back, her voice sounded tired in a way I had never heard from her. "Claire, I need to talk to you about the lease," she said. "Someone made an offer, a very large offer, on the whole building." I understood immediately who that someone was. I asked Grace not to sell, and she agreed, at least for now, though I could hear the hesitation folded into her words, like a crease that would not iron out. She had grandchildren. She had bills. She had a version of retirement she had been dreaming about for a decade, and Victor Kane's money could hand it to her overnight. I decided, foolishly perhaps, that the only way to stop this creeping pressure was to face the source of it directly. I asked around, quietly, the way people learn to ask around when they need information nobody wants to give freely. Eventually, a bartender at Hollow Street, a young man named Daniel who used to come into the bakery every Friday for a slice of lemon cake, told me where I might find him. "Be careful," Daniel said, wiping down the counter without looking at me. "Mr. Kane doesn't lose, not at anything." I went anyway. Which brings me back to that room, that folder, and that number sitting between us, like a bridge I refused to cross. "You understand," Victor said, leaning back in his chair, "that this offer is not really about the bakery." "Then what is it about?" He did not answer that directly. Instead, he studied me the way you study a painting you are trying to understand, searching for the brushstroke that explains the whole thing. "You remind me of someone," he said finally. Someone who also believed refusing me was a kind of victory. Is that a threat? It is an observation. I stood up, because staying seated any longer felt like agreeing to a conversation I had never chosen to have. I don't want your money, Mr. Kane. I want my landlord left alone, my suppliers left alone, and my shop left alone, that's all. He rose as well, slower, more deliberate, the way a man moves when he knows every eye in the room is on him, and he intends to make the moment last. You misunderstand something important, Claire. I did not send Nathan to your shop because I wanted a bakery. I sent him because your father owed me something, a long time ago, and I have been waiting patiently to collect it. The words hit me like cold water down the back of my shirt. My father died 6 years ago, I said. Whatever he owed you died with him. Debts like his don't die, Victor said quietly. They wait, and now they've found you. I wanted to ask what debt, what history, what thread connected my father, a gentleman who spent his life measuring flour and sugar, to a man like Victor Kane. But my throat had gone tight, and the room felt smaller than it had a moment ago, and I was suddenly aware of how far I was from anyone who might help me if this went wrong. I don't know what you're talking about, I managed. I believe you, Victor said, and somehow that was worse than if he had called me a liar, which makes this more interesting. He walked around the table, not toward me exactly, but close enough that I had to fight the urge to step back. Keep the money, he said, or don't. It was never really the point. Then what is the point? He paused at the door, his men falling into step around him like shadows attached to a moving light. The point, Claire, is that you just refused $10 million from a man who has never once had to ask twice for anything. Now I have to decide what that means. And so do you. He left without waiting for a response, and the room emptied out behind him, until it was just me, the folder, and the sound of my own heartbeat filling the silence he left behind. I did not open the folder. I did not touch it. I walked out of Hollow Street into the cool evening air, and it was only once I was 3 blocks away, standing at a crosswalk waiting for a light that seemed to take forever to change, that my hands finally stopped shaking. I thought I had won something in that room, some small victory of dignity over money. I did not yet understand that Victor Kane was not a man who lost, and that whatever move he made next would not look anything like defeat. I thought about calling Grace, telling her everything was fine now, that I had handled it. I thought about calling Daniel, thanking him for the warning even though I had ignored it. Instead, I walked home alone, replaying every word Victor had said about my father, turning them over like stones I could not identify the underside of. Whatever debt he mentioned, whatever history connected our families, I intended to find out. Because if there was one thing I had learned in that room, it was this. Men like Victor Kane do not chase bakeries, they chase leverage. And somehow, without knowing how or why, I had become exactly that. The next morning, when I unlocked the door of Bennett's, and the smell of fresh bread rolled out into the street like it always did, I noticed a black car parked across from the shop. It did not move. It did not honk. It simply sat there, patient, the way a predator sits when it already knows the outcome of the chase. I did not know yet what Victor's next move would be, but I understood, standing there with my keys still in the lock, that the folder I had refused was only the opening line of a conversation neither of us had finished. I thought about the folder again as I stood behind the counter that morning, waiting for the first customers to arrive. $10 million. It was the kind of number that could change a life completely, erase every worry about rent, about suppliers, about keeping the lights on through a slow winter. And yet sitting across from Victor Kane, feeling the weight of his attention pressing down on me like a physical thing, I had never once considered saying yes. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was something my father planted in me long before I understood what it meant to refuse a man like that. Either way, the decision had already been made before I ever opened my mouth, and no amount of money sliding across a table was going to change it. When Daniel came by around mid-morning, the same young man who had warned me about Victor days earlier. He ordered his usual coffee, though this time his hands were not quite steady around the cup. "You went to see him," he said quietly, not quite a question. "I did. And I'm still standing here, aren't I?" Daniel did not look reassured by that answer. For now, he said. Be careful, Claire. Men like him don't forget being told no. They just decide, eventually, what to do about it. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that Victor's calm reaction in that room had meant something closer to respect than threat. But I had known Victor Kane for less than an hour by that point, and I was not foolish enough to trust my own instincts over the warnings of someone who had watched his world from a much closer distance than I had. The black car appeared across the street just after noon, parked in the same spot it would occupy for the next several days. I noticed it first through the front window, while wiping down a table, and something cold settled low in my stomach the moment I recognized what it was. I did not call the police. Somehow, standing there watching that car sit perfectly still, engine off, no one visibly inside, I understood that calling the police would accomplish nothing except making my situation more complicated. Whatever Victor Kane intended by that quiet, patient surveillance, it was not the kind of threat any officer in this city would be willing or able to address. Instead, I went back to work, kneading dough with hands that refused to stop trembling slightly, telling myself over and over that whatever came next, I would face it the same way I had faced that folder, directly, and without flinching, no matter how much easier it might have been to look away. The black car stayed parked across from Bennett's for 6 straight days. It never approached. No one got out. It simply sat there, a quiet reminder that I was being watched, and that whatever had started in that back room at Hollow Street was far from finished. I stopped mentioning it to my staff, because every time I did, I watched fear settle into their shoulders, and fear is bad for business in ways that go beyond the obvious. On the 7th day, the car was gone, and I made the mistake of thinking that meant something good. I found out how wrong I was when my regular flower supplier called to cancel our contract, effective immediately, no explanation given beyond a mumbled line about changes in distribution priorities. I called 3 other suppliers that same afternoon. 2 never answered. The third, a woman named Ellie who ran a small mill 2 towns over, finally picked up on my 5th attempt. "Claire, I like you," she said, her voice low, like she was checking over her shoulder even through the phone. "But I can't take this order. I'm sorry. Please don't ask me why." I did not need to ask why. I already knew. That evening, I sat in the back office of Bennett's with Grace Whitmore, my landlord, going over numbers that had started to look worse by the week. Grace had aged in the last month, not in years, but in the tired way people age when stress sits on them like a second coat. "I got another call today," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Higher than the last one. Claire, I don't know how much longer I can say no." "You don't have to say no forever," I told her, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. "Just long enough for me to figure out what's happening." "And if you can't figure it out?" I did not have an answer for that, so I poured us both a cup of tea instead, the way my father used to do whenever a conversation reached a place neither of us knew how to finish. My father, Henry Bennett. The gentle man who baked bread for 40 years and never once raised his voice at me, not even when I burned an entire batch of his prized sourdough starter the summer I turned 16. I could not picture him owing anyone anything, least of all a man like Victor Kane. But Victor's words kept circling back in my mind, refusing to leave quietly. Debts like his don't die, they wait. And now they've found you. I decided that night to do something I had avoided for years. I went through my father's old boxes, the ones stored in the small storage unit behind the shop. Boxes I had never fully unpacked, because grief has a strange way of making cardboard feel heavier than it should. I found recipe cards in his handwriting, faded photographs of the original bakery he opened when I was a child, and near the bottom of the 3rd box, a small leather notebook I had never seen before. Inside, in ink that had gone soft with age, were names, dates, numbers that meant nothing to me at first glance, until I saw one name written 3 separate times, each time underlined harder than the last. Kane. My hands went cold holding that notebook. I read every page twice, searching for context that never fully arrived, only fragments. A loan, a property, a promise my father had apparently made and never finished keeping before he died. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, Nathan Ford was waiting for me outside Bennett's, leaning against a car that was not the black one from before, but similar enough that my stomach tightened at the sight of it. "Mr. Kane would like to see you," he said, polite as always, as if he were inviting me to lunch rather than delivering a summons. "Tell Mr. Kane I'm busy running a business he seems determined to destroy." Nathan's expression did not change. "He said you'd say something like that. He also said to tell you it concerns your father." That got my attention faster than any threat could have. I followed Nathan to a building I had never noticed before, tucked behind a row of shops 2 streets from Hollow Street, unremarkable from the outside, in a way that felt deliberate. Inside, it was quieter than I expected, almost like a library, rows of old filing cabinets lining the walls of a room where Victor Kane sat waiting behind a plain wooden desk. "You found the notebook," he said, before I had even sat down. "How do you know that?" "Because I know your father kept one. He showed it to me once. A long time ago, back when he still believed honesty could fix everything. I set the notebook on the desk between us, more carefully than I intended. Tell me what he owed you." Victor studied the leather cover for a long moment, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk. "Your father borrowed money from me 22 years ago, when his first bakery was failing. I helped him, not out of kindness, though people like to imagine men like me incapable of it. I helped him because I saw potential in what he was building, and I wanted a share of it." "A share of what? Flour and sugar?" "A share of the location," Victor said. "The land itself. Vine Street was worth very little back then. I believed it would not stay that way." I felt the pieces sliding into place slowly, unwillingly. "You're saying my father agreed to give you part ownership of the land Bennett's now sits on?" "I'm saying he agreed to give me part ownership once the loan reached maturity. He never repaid it in full. He died owing the final portion, and under the original agreement, that debt passed to whoever inherited the property." "Me." "You," Victor confirmed. The room felt like it had shrunk, the walls pressing closer, though nothing had physically moved. "Why didn't you just tell me this from the beginning? Why the games, the folder, the $10 million? For the first time since I had met him, something like hesitation crossed Victor's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Because the debt was never really about money, Claire. It was about proving something to myself. Your father was the only person who ever refused to sell me more than he had to, even when it would have been easier for him. I wanted to see if his daughter carried the same stubbornness. So this was a test?" "Everything is a test," Victor said. "Some of us simply choose to run them more openly than others." I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, though my voice came out sharper than I felt. "And now that I've passed, or failed, whichever this was, what happens to my shop?" Victor leaned back, folding his hands together. "The debt is real. The paperwork is real. If I wanted to take Bennett's from you tomorrow, I could, and no court in this city would stop me." "Then take it," I said, surprising myself with how steady the words came out. "Take the building, take the land, take whatever paper my father signed 22 years ago, but you will not take my name off that door while I'm still breathing, and you will not scare away one more supplier or one more landlord while pretending it isn't you." Something shifted behind Victor's eyes then, something I could not fully name, not anger, not amusement either, something closer to respect, though I refused to let myself believe it in that moment. "You really are his daughter," he said quietly. "I don't know what that means to you." "It means," Victor said, standing slowly, "that I am not going to take your shop." I blinked, certain I had misheard him. "What?" "The debt exists, but debts, like most things, are negotiable. I will give you time, Claire, real time, not the kind wrapped in threats disguised as patience. You will run your bakery without interference from me, and in exchange, you will listen to what I actually want, once you're ready to hear it. And if I never want to hear it? Then the debt remains unpaid, and eventually, I will collect it the way debts are always collected in the end." It should have felt like a trap, and in many ways it was. But standing there in that quiet room, surrounded by filing cabinets that likely held secrets belonging to half the city, I felt something unexpected settle over me. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of an understanding that Victor Kane was not simply the monster the rumors made him out to be, nor the saint his sudden mercy suggested. He was something harder to define, and far more dangerous for exactly that reason. I left the building with the notebook still in my hands, Nathan Ford trailing behind me at a respectful distance until I reached the street, where he finally spoke. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've worked for Mr. Kane a long time. I've never seen him back away from a debt before. Not once." "Then I suppose I should be flattered." "Or careful," Nathan said. "Sometimes those are the same thing, with him." I walked back to Bennett's alone, the notebook heavy in my bag, my father's careful handwriting replaying in my mind, alongside Victor's quiet, unreadable voice. My suppliers returned within the week, one by one, without explanation, the same way they had disappeared. Grace stopped receiving offers on the building. The black car never returned. On the surface, everything looked like it had settled back into place. But I understood, walking through the door of my father's bakery each morning, past the counter he built with his own hands, that nothing had truly settled at all. Victor Kane had not disappeared from my life. He had simply changed the terms of his presence in it, and I had no idea, not yet, what he intended to ask of me once he decided the time was right. I only knew that whatever it was, it would not be as simple as money. Men like Victor Kane, I was learning, never wanted only money. They wanted something far harder to hand over freely, and far more dangerous to refuse. There were nights, during that stretch of uncertainty, when I sat alone in the small apartment above Bennett's, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Victor Kane had said in that quiet room lined with filing cabinets. I kept returning to one phrase in particular, the one that had lodged itself somewhere behind my ribs and refused to loosen its grip. "You really are his daughter." I did not know, at the time, whether that was meant as a compliment or a warning. Perhaps it was both, the way most things involving Victor seemed to be both at once. Generosity wrapped around calculation, calculation wrapped around something that almost resembled care. I called my aunt one evening, my father's younger sister, the only relative left who might remember anything about his life before the bakery. She lived 2 hours outside the city, retired now, spending her days tending a garden she had always loved more than people, according to my father's old jokes about her. "Aunt Ruth," I said, once the pleasantries had passed, "did Dad ever mention someone named Doyle or Kane?" There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Where did you hear those names?" she finally asked, her voice careful in a way that told me she recognized them immediately. "It doesn't matter right now. Did he ever mention them?" "Your father asked me never to repeat certain things," Ruth said slowly. "Not even to you, especially not to you. But if those names have found their way to you now, Claire, I think it's time someone besides ghosts told you the truth." She did not tell me everything that evening, not the full picture Victor would eventually reveal in that quiet room behind Hollow Street, but she confirmed enough. Fragments about a version of my father I had never known, a young man running errands through parts of the city he later spent decades trying to forget, to make Victor's later explanation feel less like a shock and more like confirmation of something I had already begun to suspect. "He loved you more than anything," Ruth said, before we hung up. "Everything he did after you were born, every choice, every risk, was about making sure none of that old life ever touched you. I'm sorry it's touching you now anyway." I sat with that conversation for a long time afterward, turning it over the way I had turned over the notebook itself, searching for some version of my father that made sense of both the gentleman who taught me to bake and the young man Ruth had described, someone I barely recognized in her careful, reluctant retelling. It occurred to me, sitting there in the quiet of my apartment, that Victor Kane might be the only person left alive who could fill in the details Ruth refused to share, the only bridge remaining between the father I had known and the one who apparently existed before I was born. That realization complicated everything further, tangling my growing wariness of him, together with something uncomfortably close to gratitude. Grace noticed the change in me over the following days, the way I answered her questions a beat too slowly, distracted by thoughts I refused to fully share even with her. "You don't have to carry this alone," she told me one afternoon, flour dusting her forearms as she helped restock the display case. "Whatever it is." "I know," I said. "I'm just still learning how big it actually is." She did not push further, though I caught her watching me sometimes, with the same worried expression she wore whenever the phone rang unexpectedly, as though she too sensed that the quiet stretch we were living in was only a pause, not an ending. 3 weeks passed before Victor Kane asked anything of me, and when he finally did, it arrived not as a summons, but as a simple handwritten note, delivered by Nathan Ford on a rainy Tuesday morning. Meet me tonight. Bring the notebook. I stared at the note for a long time before folding it into my apron pocket, the way I had once folded worries about rent and flower prices, back before Victor Kane became the largest worry in my life. Business at Bennett's had steadied since our meeting. Suppliers returned, the black car never came back, and Grace stopped flinching every time her phone rang. For 3 weeks, I allowed myself to believe the worst had passed. I should have known better. That evening, I found Victor waiting for me in the same quiet room behind the unremarkable building, seated at the same plain wooden desk, though something in his posture had changed. He looked, for the first time since I had met him, almost tired. "You wanted the notebook," I said, setting it down between us. "I wanted to show you something in it," he corrected. "Something I don't think you noticed." He opened the leather cover carefully, turning past the pages I had already memorized, stopping at one near the back I had skimmed too quickly to understand. My father's handwriting again, but different this time, less like bookkeeping, and more like a letter he had never sent. "If anything happens to me before this debt is settled, look after Claire the way I could never fully look after her. She does not know what I built before her, and she should never have to pay for choices she never made." I read it twice, my throat tightening painfully around words I did not understand yet. "What choices?" I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "What did my father build before me?" Victor closed the notebook slowly. "Your father did not start as a baker, Claire. Before Bennett's, before Vine Street, he worked for a man named Marcus Doyle, running deliveries through parts of this city most people never see after dark. Deliveries of what? Things that were never meant to reach the people who paid for them," Victor said carefully. "It was not a long career, 2 years, perhaps less, but it was enough to put him in debt to men who did not forgive debts easily, myself included." I sat down slowly across from him, my legs no longer trusting themselves to hold me upright. "My father was involved in something like that. He spent his whole life measuring flour. He taught Sunday school for a decade. People are allowed to become better than where they started," Victor said, something almost gentle threading through his voice. "Your father did exactly that. He left that life behind the day you were born, according to what he told me. He wanted something different for you, something clean. The bakery was part of that. So was the debt he took from me, which he used, ironically, to finally leave Doyle's operation behind for good. Then why does the debt still matter? Why involve me at all, if he already paid for his own freedom?" Victor's expression tightened, the tiredness in his face deepening into something closer to regret. "Because Marcus Doyle did not simply let your father walk away. He considers the debt your father owed him unpaid, regardless of what he owed me. And unlike me, Doyle does not offer patience to the families of men who leave his organization." The room went cold around me, though nothing had physically changed. "Are you saying this Doyle person is a threat to me?" "I am saying," Victor said, "that the reason I brought you into my building 3 weeks ago, the reason I offered you money you refused, was never truly about collecting your father's debt to me. It was to bring you somewhere Doyle could not easily reach you, while I decided what to do about a threat that has been building against your family for longer than you realize." I felt something crack open inside my chest, anger and fear tangled together so tightly I could not separate one from the other. "You used me. You let me believe I was fighting you, when the entire time you were protecting me from someone else?" "I let you believe what was safest for you to believe," Victor said. "If I had told you the truth from the beginning, you would have gone looking for Doyle yourself, out of some misplaced sense of needing to face danger honestly, rather than hide from it. I have met people like you before, Claire. Your father was one of them. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but some small honest part of me knew he was not entirely mistaken. I had walked into Hollow Street alone, against every warning Daniel had given me, because facing danger directly had always felt safer than waiting for it to arrive on its own schedule. "What does Doyle want?" I asked instead, my voice steadier now, anger settling into something I could use. "The same thing men like him always want. Money first. But more than that, he wants to make an example of your father's escape, to remind everyone still working for him that leaving comes with consequences, even years later, even through the people left behind. Meaning me. Meaning you, Victor confirmed. I stood and walked to the small window at the edge of the room, watching rain streak down the glass in thin, uneven lines. So what happens now? You've told me the truth. Do you expect me to simply trust you, after everything that's happened? No, Victor said. I expect you to be angry. I expect you to feel used, because in some ways, you were. But I also expect you to understand that Doyle will not wait much longer before making his move, and when he does, my protection, whatever you think of it, is currently the only thing standing between your bakery, your landlord, your staff, and real harm. I turned back to face him, searching his expression for the manipulation I was certain must still be hiding somewhere beneath his calm exterior. I did not find it, or if it was there, it hid itself better than I could uncover. Why do you even care? I asked. You said it yourself. This was never really about money for you. So what is it about, really? Victor was quiet for a long moment, longer than felt comfortable, before he answered. Your father did something for me once, that I never repaid properly. When my own operation faced a threat from a rival years ago, he warned me before anyone else knew, at real risk to himself. I have spent years believing that debt settled between us, until his notebook reminded me it never truly was. So this is about honor, I said, something between disbelief and reluctant understanding coloring my voice. A man like you, worried about honor. Men like me survive because of honor, Claire. Not the kind people write songs about, the practical kind. The kind that makes other people trust your word enough to do business with you at all. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, letting the silence stretch between us while the rain continued its steady rhythm against the window. What do you need from me? I finally asked. For now, only patience, Victor said. Doyle does not know yet that I am aware of his plans. That gives me time to prepare, to protect what needs protecting, without alerting him to how much I already know. But that time is limited, and there may come a moment where I need you to trust a decision of mine without understanding the reasoning behind it immediately. That sounds like exactly the kind of thing that gets people hurt. It does, Victor agreed, with a bluntness I had not expected. Which is why I am telling you now, honestly, rather than waiting until that moment arrives and hoping you simply comply. Something about that honesty, blunt and unflattering as it was, settled something in me that all his previous calm reassurance had failed to touch. I had spent weeks assuming Victor Kane operated purely through manipulation, every kind word calculated, every gesture designed to serve some hidden purpose. Perhaps some of that remained true, but standing in that quiet room, rain streaking the windows, I found myself believing, against every instinct that had kept me cautious around him, that at least this particular truth had cost him something to share. I need time to think, I told him, about all of this, about what I'm willing to trust. Take it, Victor said. But Claire, take it quickly. Doyle does not offer the same patience I do. I left the building that night, carrying more weight than I had arrived with, the notebook back in my bag, my father's secret history unraveling new questions faster than I could answer the old ones. Walking home through streets slick with rain, I found myself thinking not of Victor Kane's calm, unreadable eyes, nor even of the danger Marcus Doyle apparently represented, but of my father, folding dough at 4 a.m, teaching me patience and gentleness, never once revealing the harder version of himself he had buried to build the life he wanted for me. I did not know, walking home that night, how much more of that buried history would surface before this was over, nor how directly it would soon put me in Doyle's path myself. I only knew that whatever protection Victor Kane offered, however complicated its origins, I no longer had the luxury of refusing it outright. The following morning, Grace called me before I had even unlocked the bakery door, her voice tight with an urgency I had not heard from her before. Claire, there's a man here, she said, asking about the building, asking about you specifically. He gave a name, Doyle. My hands went cold around the phone, the rain from the night before nothing compared to the sudden chill spreading through my chest. Don't say anything to him, I said quickly. I'm coming right now. I hung up and ran, notebook still in my bag, Victor's warning about limited time echoing louder in my ears with every step. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I understood with complete clarity that whatever quiet arrangement Victor and I had reached the night before, it was about to be tested far sooner than either of us had prepared for. I ran the last 2 blocks to Bennett's, my breath coming in ragged bursts by the time I reached the door, my mind racing through every possible version of what I might find inside. Grace stood exactly where I had left her over the phone, though Doyle was gone by the time I arrived, the shop empty, except for her and the lingering unease that seemed to cling to the air like smoke after a fire. "He didn't touch anything," Grace said quickly before I could ask. "He just wanted to talk, mostly to me, actually, about you, about the shop, about how long we'd known each other." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing important. I've dealt with men like that before, Claire, though never quite this close to home. I know how to keep a conversation shallow when it needs to be." I hugged her then, longer than either of us probably expected, grateful in a way that went beyond words for the steadiness she had shown while I was still 3 blocks away, racing toward danger I could not have prevented even if I had arrived sooner. That evening, once the shop had closed and Grace had finally gone home to rest, I sat alone behind the counter with the notebook open in front of me, rereading my father's letter for what felt like the 100th time. Look after Claire the way I could never fully look after her. The words felt different now, heavier, knowing what Ruth had confirmed and what Victor had explained, understanding finally the shape of the danger my father had spent his whole life trying to shield me from. I thought about calling Victor immediately, but something made me hesitate, a small, stubborn part of me that wanted to sit with this fear alone for a while, before allowing anyone else, even someone offering protection, to carry any part of it alongside me. I had spent years building Bennett's on my own, proving to myself and to the memory of my father that I did not need anyone else's money or influence to survive. Admitting how quickly that independence had become fragile, how easily one man in a gray coat had unsettled everything I believed I controlled, was not an admission that came easily. Eventually, though, I did call Nathan, because whatever pride I carried was not worth risking Grace's safety, or my own, over a lesson in stubbornness that no longer served any real purpose. The days between that first visit from Doyle and my next meeting with Victor felt longer than any stretch of time I could remember. I kept the shop open, because closing it would have meant admitting defeat in a way I refused to accept, but I noticed every unfamiliar face that walked through the door, every car that idled a moment too long outside the window. Fear has a way of rewriting your perception of the ordinary world, turning every small detail into a potential warning sign. I called Ruth again during that stretch, hoping for more details than she had offered before, but her voice grew guarded the moment I mentioned Doyle's visit. "Claire, please," she said. "Whatever Victor Kane has told you, whatever he's asked of you, be careful how deep you let yourself go into that world. Your father spent his whole life trying to build a wall between you and it. I don't want to watch that wall crumble because of choices made out of fear rather than clarity." "I'm not choosing anything yet," I told her, though even as I said it, I understood how untrue that had already become. I had chosen, the moment I refused to hand Victor his money back at Hollow Street. I had chosen again, the moment I agreed to hear him out about Doyle, rather than walking away entirely. Every step since had simply been the slow unfolding of decisions I had already made, without fully realizing their weight. On the 4th day after Doyle's visit, Nathan arrived at Bennett's unannounced, his expression more serious than I had seen it before. "Mr. Kane wants you to know something before your next conversation," he said, keeping his voice low despite the shop being empty at that hour. "Doyle has been asking questions around the city, about your father's old contacts, about people who might still owe him loyalty from years ago." "Meaning what?" "Meaning he's testing the ground beneath you, seeing how much of your father's old world still exists, that he can use as leverage, separate from whatever pressure he's already applying directly through you." The idea that there might be other threads connecting my father to this hidden world, threads I knew nothing about and could not anticipate, settled over me with a weight heavier than anything Doyle had said directly to my face. "How many more surprises are hiding in that notebook?" I asked, mostly to myself, though Nathan answered anyway. "Probably more than either of us can guess," he said. "Your father lived 2 very different lives, Claire. Untangling them completely might take longer than any of us want it to." I appreciated his honesty, even as it deepened the unease already settling into my chest. Whatever calm I had managed to hold on to since our meeting with Victor felt thinner now, stretched over a growing awareness that this conflict was far larger and far older than the few weeks I had personally experienced it. That night, unable to sleep, I walked the quiet streets around Vine Street alone, past shuttered shops and empty sidewalks, trying to imagine my father walking these same streets decades earlier, young and unafraid, in ways I could no longer picture clearly. I wondered what he would think, watching his daughter navigate the very world he had sacrificed so much to escape. I wondered whether he would be proud of how steadily I refused to back down, or heartbroken that his sacrifice had ultimately failed to protect me from exactly what he feared most. I did not have answers to either question. I only had the notebook, growing heavier in my bag with every new revelation, and a meeting with Victor still ahead of me that I suspected would demand more from me than any conversation we had shared so far. Grace was standing behind the counter when I arrived, her hands folded tightly in front of her, trying and failing to look calm for the two customers seated near the window. The man waiting near the door did not look dangerous at first glance. He wore a plain gray coat, unremarkable shoes, the kind of face you would forget within minutes of passing him on the street. That, I would later learn, was exactly the point. "You must be Claire," he said, before I had fully crossed the threshold. "Marcus Doyle. I believe your father mentioned me once or twice." "He never mentioned you at all," I said, keeping my voice level despite the pounding in my chest. Doyle smiled, unbothered. Then he was even more careful than I remembered. "Smart man, your father. Shame he ran out of time before finishing what he started." "I don't know what you think he started, but whatever debt you believe exists between you, it isn't mine to pay." "Isn't it?" Doyle tilted his head, studying me the way Victor had studied me weeks earlier, though something colder lived behind Doyle's eyes, something that made the comparison feel almost insulting to Victor by contrast. "Your father took something valuable from my organization when he left. Information, trust, a promise of loyalty he broke the moment your mother told him she was expecting you. I have waited a long time to collect on that broken promise." "He's dead," I said. "Whatever he owed you, he can't pay it now." "No," Doyle agreed, "but you can." The two customers near the window quietly gathered their things and left, sensing, the way people often do, that something in the room had shifted into territory better avoided. Grace reached for the phone behind the counter, and Doyle's eyes flicked toward her with a warning so subtle I almost missed it. "I wouldn't," he said pleasantly. "Not unless you want this conversation to become more complicated than it needs to be." Grace's hand froze halfway to the receiver. "What do you want?" I asked, stepping between Doyle and the counter, though I had no plan for what came after that step. "Simple things, at first," Doyle said. "Access to certain records your father kept. Contacts he maintained even after leaving my organization. Contacts I believe he passed along to you without either of you fully understanding what you were inheriting." "I don't have any contacts. I run a bakery." "You have a notebook," Doyle said, and the casual way he said it made my stomach drop entirely. He knew about the notebook, which meant, somehow, someone close enough to Victor's world had let that information travel further than it should have. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though the lie sounded thin even to my own ears. Doyle studied me for a long moment, then smiled again, colder this time. "I'll give you a week, Claire. Bring me the notebook, and whatever else your father left behind that concerns my organization, and this conversation ends here, quietly, without further disruption to your charming little shop." "And if I don't? Then I suppose we'll have a very different kind of conversation," Doyle said, straightening his coat as he moved toward the door. "One that involves considerably less patience on my part." He left without waiting for a response, the small bell above the door ringing cheerfully behind him, absurdly mismatched with the fear now settling over the room. Grace let out a breath she had clearly been holding since Doyle first walked in. "Claire, who was that man? What notebook is he talking about?" I did not have an easy answer for her, so instead I called Nathan Ford, my hands shaking as I dialed the number he had given me weeks earlier for emergencies. He picked up on the second ring. "Doyle just left my shop," I said, without preamble. "He knows about the notebook." There was a pause on the line, brief but heavy. "Stay where you are. Mr. Kane will meet you within the hour. Victor arrived faster than that, walking into Bennett's alone, without Nathan, without the usual quiet procession of men that typically surrounded him. He looked, standing in the middle of my father's bakery, strangely out of place, though not in the way I expected. Something in his posture suggested this location mattered to him beyond its usefulness as leverage. "Tell me exactly what he said," Victor instructed, and I recounted the conversation as precisely as I could remember it, watching his expression shift from careful neutrality into something sharper, more focused. "He's moving faster than I anticipated," Victor said, mostly to himself, "which means someone told him more than they should have." "Someone close to you," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "Someone close to me," Victor agreed grimly, "which is a problem I will address separately. For now, we need to focus on what Doyle actually wants, and whether giving it to him solves anything or simply delays the inevitable. You said giving him the notebook would end this." "Doyle said that," Victor corrected. "Men like Doyle rarely mean what they promise, especially when the promise costs them nothing to make and everything to keep." I felt something in me deflate slightly. The small hope I had been holding on to since Doyle's visit, collapsing under the weight of Victor's blunt assessment. "Then what do we do?" Victor was quiet for a moment, studying the counter, the shelves of bread behind it, the small framed photograph of my father that hung near the register, the one where he was laughing at something just out of frame, flour dusted across his apron. "We give Doyle something," Victor said finally, "but not what he's asking for." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning we let him believe he's winning, right up until the moment he realizes he isn't." Over the following days, Victor's plan unfolded with a precision that unsettled me almost as much as Doyle's threats had. He arranged, through channels I did not fully understand, for false records to circulate, information that appeared to satisfy Doyle's demands without actually compromising anything real. Nathan Ford moved through the city quietly, gathering information of his own, tracing the leak that had given Doyle knowledge of the notebook in the first place. I spent those days in a strange limbo, running Bennett's during the day, serving customers who had no idea how close danger had come to their favorite morning stop, then meeting with Victor each evening to review whatever new piece of the plan had developed. Grace stayed close throughout, refusing to leave despite my repeated suggestions that she take a few days away from the shop until things settled. "Your father stood in this exact spot every morning for years," she told me one evening, gesturing toward the counter. "I'm not abandoning it now, not for anyone, including men in gray coats making threats." Her stubbornness reminded me painfully of my own, and I understood, watching her, exactly where some of my own refusal to back down had come from, even before I ever met Victor Kane or Marcus Doyle. On the fifth day, Nathan finally identified the leak. A young man named Curtis, recently hired into Victor's organization, had been quietly feeding information to Doyle for months, likely in exchange for money or protection Victor's organization no longer offered him after some earlier dispute I never learned the details of. "He's been dealt with," Victor told me simply, when I asked what happened to Curtis, and something in his tone made clear that further questions would not be welcomed. I did not push. Some parts of this world, I was learning quickly, were better left unexamined too closely. On the sixth day, the day before Doyle's deadline, Victor called me to the same quiet building behind Hollow Street, the notebook already sitting on the desk between us when I arrived. "Tomorrow, Doyle expects a meeting," Victor said. "He believes he is receiving what he asked for. Instead, he will receive proof that his own organization is unstable, riddled with the same kind of loyalty problems he accused your father of having decades ago. You're going to expose him." "I'm going to remind him," Victor corrected, "that threatening families connected to my organization carries consequences he has apparently forgotten how to fear." "And if he doesn't back down?" Victor's expression hardened slightly. "Then he will learn very quickly why very few people in this city choose to test my patience twice." I studied him across the desk, searching for the calculation I had once been so certain lived behind everything he said and did. I still found traces of it, undeniably, but threaded through that calculation now was something else, something that had not been present in our first meeting at Hollow Street, when $10 million sat between us, like a wall neither of us had been willing to cross. "Why are you really doing this?" I asked. The truth this time, not the version about honor and old debts. Victor considered the question longer than I expected before answering. Because watching you refuse that money, weeks ago, reminded me of something I had forgotten mattered. Not everyone can be bought, Claire. Not everyone should be. I spent a long time assuming otherwise, and somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing when that assumption stopped being true. It was not quite an answer, and it was not quite enough to fully explain the risk he was taking on my behalf. A risk that involved exposing weaknesses in his own organization to protect a woman he had, by his own admission, initially approached purely as leverage for an old debt. But it was, I realized, the most honest thing he had said to me since Hollow Street, and for reasons I did not fully understand myself, it was enough, at least for that moment, to make me trust him completely with whatever came next. The following evening, when Doyle arrived expecting victory, he found instead a version of events that unraveled every assumption he had built his threats upon, though I would not learn the full details of that confrontation until much later, when the shock of everything that followed had finally settled into something I could look back on clearly. That night, waiting alone above the bakery while whatever happened between Victor and Doyle unfolded somewhere across the city, I found myself pacing the small apartment more than sitting still. Every sound from the street below made me flinch, every passing car pulling my attention toward the window, though I understood logically that nothing happening tonight would announce itself so obviously. Grace stayed with me for part of that evening, though eventually, I convinced her to go home and rest, promising to call the moment I heard anything. She left reluctantly, glancing back twice before disappearing down the stairs, and I understood, watching her go, how much this entire ordeal had asked of people who had no real reason to carry any of it beside me. I thought about my father again, as I often did during quiet moments like this one, trying to imagine him at my age, caught in exactly this kind of uncertainty, waiting to learn whether choices made in rooms he could not enter would determine the shape of his future. I wondered if he had felt this same particular kind of helplessness, the specific frustration of mattering enormously to a situation while having no direct way to influence its outcome. Nathan called just after midnight, his voice carrying a controlled calm that told me the news, whatever it was, had not gone badly. "It's done," he said simply. "Doyle knows now that his own house isn't as steady as he believed. Mr. Kane wants you to know you're safe, at least for tonight, and that he'll explain everything in the morning." I did not sleep much after that call. Relief and lingering adrenaline tangled together in a way that made rest feel impossible. But I no longer paced the apartment either. Instead, I sat by the window overlooking Vine Street, watching the quiet darkness settle over the shop below, thinking about how strange it was that safety, when it finally arrived, felt almost as disorienting as danger had. The following days brought a kind of stillness to the city that I had not expected, a slow unwinding of tension that revealed itself gradually, rather than all at once. Suppliers who had never once faltered continued their deliveries without interruption. Grace's phone stopped ringing with unfamiliar numbers. Even the light through the bakery windows seemed to fall differently, softer somehow, though I understood that was likely only my own perception shifting rather than anything about the world itself. I met with Ruth again during that stretch, driving out to see her in person, rather than relying on hurried phone calls squeezed between opening and closing the shop. She looked older than I remembered, though her garden remained as immaculate as ever, rows of vegetables and flowers arranged with the same careful precision my father had once brought to his bread. "You look tired," she said, settling me at her kitchen table with a cup of tea neither of us really wanted. "It's been a long few weeks," I admitted. "Your father would be proud of you," she said, unprompted, watching my reaction carefully. "Not because you survived any of this, though that matters too, because you refused to let it change who you are underneath it. That was always the thing he worried about most, that this world, if it ever found you, would turn you into someone he wouldn't recognize." "And have I?" I asked. "Turned into someone else?" Ruth considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "No," she said finally. "If anything, I think you've become more like the person he always hoped you'd be, even if the circumstances that revealed it were nothing either of you would have chosen." I carried that conversation with me on the drive back to the city, turning it over alongside everything else that had happened, trying to make sense of how thoroughly my understanding of my father, of myself, and of the strange, uneasy alliance I had formed with Victor Kane had shifted since that first folder landed on the table between us. Nathan told me later that the meeting between Victor and Doyle lasted less than 15 minutes, though the ripples from it reached far beyond that quiet window of time. I was not there myself. Victor insisted I stay at Bennett's that evening, surrounded by the ordinary comfort of flour and warm bread, far from whatever exchange took place in a room I never saw and never fully learned the location of. I understood, without needing it explained, that some things Victor intended to keep separate from me entirely, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but out of something closer to protection. What I did learn, in the days that followed, unfolded slowly, through Nathan's careful retelling, and the visible changes it produced throughout the city. Doyle arrived expecting confirmation that his threats had worked, that Victor had bent to pressure the same way lesser men might have. Instead, Victor presented him with evidence that Doyle's own organization had grown unstable from within, riddled with the same disloyalty Doyle had once accused my father of, proof carefully gathered over the preceding days by people loyal to Victor rather than to fear alone. "You've spent years punishing men for leaving you," Victor reportedly told him, without ever asking why they wanted to leave in the first place. "Perhaps it's time you looked closer to home for your answers." Doyle did not back down immediately. Men like him rarely do. But within a week, cracks that had already been forming beneath the surface of his operation widened into something he could no longer ignore or hide. Two of his most trusted lieutenants left his organization entirely, taking with them information that made Doyle's remaining threats considerably harder to enforce. Whatever leverage he believed he held over me and my father's memory dissolved along with the loyalty he had always taken for granted. He never came back to Bennett's. I never saw him again, not in person, though his name occasionally surfaced afterward in quiet conversations Nathan and I had, always followed by the reassurance that Doyle's reach in the city had shrunk considerably since our confrontation. I want to say the aftermath felt like relief, and in many ways it did. Grace returned to her usual steady calm, no longer flinching at unexpected phone calls. My suppliers stayed reliable. The black car never returned to its spot across the street, and Bennett settled back into the rhythm it had always known before Victor Kane's folder first appeared on that table at Hollow Street. But something else had shifted too, something I had not anticipated, and did not fully understand until weeks after the danger had passed. Victor stopped by Bennett's on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary morning that would have seemed impossible only a month earlier. He came alone, without Nathan, without the careful procession of men who usually surrounded him, and sat at the small table near the window, the same window that let in the morning sun the way it always had, filling the shop with that familiar cinnamon and butter smell. "You didn't have to expose your own organization's problems to protect me," I said, setting a cup of coffee in front of him, the same coffee Nathan had once ordered and never touched. "I know," Victor said simply. "Then why did you?" He considered the question the way he seemed to consider most things, carefully, without rushing toward an easy answer. "Because the alternative was watching you carry a debt that was never truly yours, for the rest of your life, waiting for men like Doyle to resurface whenever it suited them. I decided that outcome was unacceptable." "And the $10 million? I asked, unable to resist the small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "Was that ever really an offer, or only ever a test?" "Both," Victor admitted. "I offer money to see who takes it and who doesn't. Most people take it. You didn't. That told me something important before I even understood why it mattered." "What did it tell you?" "That whatever your father built in you, the part of him that refused to sell what mattered, simply because the price was high enough, survived intact. I don't encounter that often, Claire. When I do, I find myself unwilling to let it be destroyed by men like Doyle, or debts inherited from decisions made before you were even born." I sat down across from him, the notebook resting between us on the table, no longer feeling like the weight it once had. "What happens now?" I asked. "The debt, the notebook, everything my father left behind. Is it finally settled?" "The debt was settled the moment I decided it mattered less than protecting the person who inherited it," Victor said. "As for the notebook, I think it belongs with you now, entirely. Whatever history it holds, it's yours to keep or release as you choose." I picked up the notebook, running my thumb along its worn leather cover, feeling the weight of my father's careful handwriting settle into something closer to memory than burden. "You could have simply taken the bakery," I said quietly. "Weeks ago at Hollow Street, you had every legal right to, according to what you told me." "I could have," Victor agreed. "Then why didn't you?" "Because taking something isn't the same as earning it," he said. "I spent years assuming those two things were interchangeable. I no longer believe that." Something in his voice, quiet and unpracticed in a way his usual calm rarely allowed, made me realize how much had shifted since that first afternoon in the back room at Hollow Street, when $10 million sat between us like an uncrossable wall. The wall had not disappeared entirely. Victor Kane remained a man whose name still carried weight and fear throughout the city, a man whose world operated by rules I would never fully understand or fully accept. But something in how he moved through that world, at least when it came to me, had changed in ways neither of us had expected when this began. "I have a proposition for you," Victor said, after a long pause, the corner of his mouth curving into something almost like nervousness, an expression I had never once seen on him before. "Not money this time, something else entirely." "I'm listening." "Dinner," he said. "Just dinner. No folders, no debts, no notebooks. An evening where neither of us has anything to prove to the other." I studied him for a long moment, searching for the calculation that had defined every previous interaction between us, the hidden angle, the leverage disguised as generosity. I did not find it this time, or if it existed, it hid itself well enough that I no longer felt the urge to search for it. "Just dinner," I repeated. "Just dinner," he confirmed. I thought about my father then, folding dough at 4 in the morning, teaching me patience long before I understood why patience mattered, building a life meant to shield me from exactly the kind of world Victor Kane represented, only for that world to find me anyway, delivered through a folder holding more money than either of us truly cared about in the end. "All right," I said finally, "dinner, but you're paying, and it has nothing to do with debts, old or otherwise." Something that might have been a genuine smile crossed Victor's face then, brief but real, the first expression I had seen from him that seemed entirely free of calculation. "Agreed," he said. Grace watched the entire exchange from behind the counter, her eyebrows raised in silent commentary. She wisely chose not to voice aloud until Victor had left the shop, the small bell above the door ringing behind him. "That man offered you $10 million a month ago," she said, once we were alone, "and now he's asking you to dinner instead." "Strange, isn't it?" I said, gathering the empty coffee cup from the table. "Strange," Grace agreed, "but not unwelcome, from where I'm standing." I did not fully understand, that quiet Tuesday morning, everything that decision would eventually lead to, nor how thoroughly it would reshape both our lives in the months that followed. I only knew that whatever $10 million had failed to buy, something far simpler, an honest dinner between two people finally free of debts and folders and old family history, had somehow succeeded instead. My father once told me that the things worth having were rarely the things people tried hardest to sell you. I had spent years assuming that lesson applied only to bread and flour, to the small honest work of building something with your own hands. Standing in Bennett's that morning, watching Victor Kane's car pull away from the curb without a single black shadow trailing behind it, I understood, finally, that the lesson had always meant something larger than that. Some things could not be bought, no matter the price offered. And sometimes, the very act of refusing them was what made everything that came afterward worth having at all. The bakery stayed exactly where it had always been, on Vine Street, filling the morning air with cinnamon and butter, my father's name still painted carefully above the door, but everything around it had changed, quietly, irreversibly, in ways $10 million never could have purchased, no matter how large the number written across that folder had been. And for the first time since Victor Kane first walked into my life, I found myself looking forward to whatever came next, rather than bracing myself against it. Our first dinner together happened on a Friday evening, at a small restaurant several streets away from Vine Street, quiet enough that neither of us worried about unfamiliar faces watching too closely. Victor arrived first, standing when I walked in, a small gesture that felt oddly formal for a man who had spent our previous conversations seated behind desks, controlling every room he occupied. "You came," he said, as though there had been real doubt about it. "I said I would." "People say many things they don't intend to follow through on," Victor said, pulling out my chair before I could reach it myself. "I've learned not to assume otherwise, even with people I've come to trust." We talked that evening about things that had nothing to do with debts or notebooks, or the careful machinery of his world. He asked about the bakery's early days, about my father's recipes, about the specific memory of learning to fold dough that I had carried with me since childhood. I found myself asking questions in return, careful ones at first, about his own history, how a man ends up running an organization like his, whether he had ever imagined a different life for himself before circumstances or choices led him here instead. "Everyone imagines a different life at some point," Victor said, turning his glass slowly between his fingers. "Most of us simply run out of chances to choose it before the world decides for us instead. Do you regret the life you ended up with?" He considered the question longer than I expected, the same careful consideration he brought to everything. "Some days," he admitted, "other days, less so. Meeting you has complicated my answer to that question more than I expected it to." I did not know quite what to say to that, so I let the silence settle between us instead. Comfortable in a way, silence rarely was during our earlier conversations, when every pause had felt loaded with calculation or threat. Over the following weeks, dinners like that one became a quiet, steady rhythm, folded into the busier rhythm of running Bennett's. Victor never asked me to compromise anything about the shop, never suggested I owed him further explanation for decisions I made about suppliers or staff, or the direction I wanted to take my father's legacy. Grace, initially wary of the entire arrangement, gradually softened toward him, though she never fully abandoned her watchful skepticism, the kind reserved for anyone who had once offered me $10 million across a table, meant to intimidate rather than genuinely help. "He's different around you," she observed one afternoon, watching Victor through the front window as he waited outside for our now regular Friday dinner. "I don't know if that's a good thing or a dangerous one, but it's certainly different." "Maybe it's both," I said, echoing something Victor himself had told me weeks earlier, back when I still assumed every kind gesture from him carried a hidden cost I had not yet identified. I never fully abandoned my caution around him, not completely, not even months later. Some habits, once learned through necessity, do not disappear entirely, simply because the immediate danger that created them has passed. But the caution softened, gradually, into something closer to respect, and eventually, into something I struggled for a long time to name honestly, even to myself. Doyle's name surfaced only rarely after that, mostly in updates Nathan shared during our occasional conversations about the broader shifts happening across the city. His organization continued fracturing slowly, weakened by the loyalty problems Victor had exposed during their confrontation, though Victor was careful to remind me, whenever the subject arose, that men like Doyle rarely disappeared completely, only diminished enough to stop being an immediate threat. "Stay aware," he told me once, over dinner, several months after everything had settled. "Not fearful, just aware. The world I live in doesn't offer permanent peace, Claire, only quieter stretches between disruptions." I appreciated that honesty, the same way I had appreciated it that rainy night in the room lined with filing cabinets, when he first explained the true nature of my father's debt. Victor Kane was never going to be a simple man, nor was the world surrounding him ever going to be entirely safe or predictable. But I had learned, through everything that happened since that first folder appeared on the table between us, that safety built entirely on avoiding complexity was never the kind of safety my father had actually wanted for me. He had wanted me to be capable, steady, unwilling to be bought or broken by whatever pressure the world eventually applied. Somewhere between refusing $10 million and sitting across from Victor Kane over quiet dinners months later, I understood that I had become exactly that, not because Victor had shaped me into it, but because the foundation had always been there, built patiently over years of watching my father knead dough at 4 a.m, teaching me without ever fully explaining why patience and refusal to compromise mattered as much as they did. Grace still runs the front counter most mornings, though she has slowly handed more responsibility to a young woman named Olivia we hired several months ago, someone who reminds me, in small ways, of who I was before any of this began, eager, and a little unaware of how large the world beyond Vine Street could actually be. I kept my father's notebook, though I no longer carry it with me the way I once did, back when its secrets felt too dangerous to leave unattended. It sits now in a drawer behind the counter, close enough to reach if I ever need it again, distant enough that it no longer feels like the weight it once was. Victor still visits most Fridays, sometimes with Nathan trailing a respectful distance behind, more often alone, settling into the same table near the window that catches the morning sun so beautifully. He orders the same coffee every time, the one Nathan once ordered and never touched, though Victor always finishes his completely now, as though some part of him has finally settled into belonging somewhere gentler than the world he built his reputation within. I do not know what the future holds for either of us, whether the quiet stretch we currently occupy will last, or whether some new threat, born from old debts or unfinished business, neither of us can fully anticipate, will eventually test us again, the way Doyle once did. But I know this much clearly. Standing behind my father's counter each morning, watching sunlight spill across tables he built with his own hands. Whatever comes next, I will not face it the way I once feared I might, alone, unprepared, or willing to be bought by anyone offering a price large enough to tempt me. Some things, I learned, are worth more than any number written across a folder. My father knew that long before I did, and somewhere between refusing Victor Kane's money and choosing, freely, to let him stay in my life afterward, I finally understood exactly what that lesson had always meant.